As South Africa commemorates 30 years of constitutional democracy and the achievements of human rights, the country can either look back at a proud history or perhaps with regret looking at its current status of human rights. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered with me, Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. Apartheid was indeed the biggest obstacle which South Africa has had to surmount, but 3 decades later, the triple challenges of poverty, unemployment and inequality have become the core threat of the very basis for which South Africa fought vigorously against segregation. Many unsung heroes and heroines paid with their lives. And so tonight we ask, has South Africa's human rights record regressed? Joining us for this discussion is Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, Ronald Lamola, as well as President of the General Industries Workers Union of South Africa, Memetle Sibei. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We very much appreciate your time, Minister. 30 years into our democracy, how do you assess the extent to which we have advanced human rights?
Thank you very much, Sizwe, and to the viewers at home.
Welcome back.
Thank you. We had a conference, as you are aware, assessing the 30 years of our democracy. There was an acknowledgement in the conference that indeed there has been progress and there is also challenges. There's progress in terms of the franchise rights, right to vote, in terms of rights to freedom of expression. And some of the speakers saying that in other countries, during elections, you can't criticize the sitting government, they switch off the internet and all that. But in this country, everyone is free, they can participate. And also there has been progress in dealing with some of the social challenges related to provision of education, water, which was meant for the few and all that. But there is still challenges, even in all those aspects. And secondly, with regards to socio-economic rights, to build and create an equal society in terms of creating an inclusive economy. And that should be what becomes the focal point of us going into the future, particularly ensuring that we live in line with Section 9 of the Constitution of the Bill of Rights, that of creating an equal society. And that is what conference focused on. And that is where ourselves, we will have to come in to ensure that going forward, all legislations must begin to mainstream issues of equality, whether it's in the economy, whether it's on social, whatever aspect of government and policies, either even in the private sector. So I do think that reflect that for us to take the revolution to its a proper conclusion, we need to satisfy and deal with this issue of economic equality and inclusivity.
Mr. Sibei, the same question to you. How would you assess where we are on this commemorative day in terms of advancing and protecting human rights 30 years on?
I mean, firstly, I think we should start by saluting those heroes and heroines of our struggles who made sacrifice, including the martyrs that were massacred on this day in Sharpeville, 1960. Them and many others paid a dear price, the ultimate price with their lives for us to be free as we are. The end of apartheid marked a historical turning point. And I think in the past 30 years, dismantlement of the structures of apartheid regime, the end of the military, police terror and repression, the daily humiliations of the black majority in this country, all of that, I think, is worth celebration. And any person who tells you that there's no change doesn't know what the lives of the black majority was under apartheid. That said, I think it's an indictment on this government of the ANC that you hear people saying that their lives has gotten very worse. And what do they mean by that? And these are not just white people who, miss the good old days of apartheid, of their privilege and so on, even within the black working class. And that is because the ANC, by every measure of social advancement and conditions of the working class, its performance in government has been nothing short of a complete catastrophe for the masses of the working class people. All the rights that we ought to be celebrating today. You look, for instance, at the right to housing, at the right to education, at the right, to public health. All of that. Participation rates amongst young people in education, for instance, higher education, for instance, among the black Africans, is only at 5.5%. That is, for every 100, young black person, black African, of the age between 18 and 29, you are looking at only 5 of them that are at university, right? Amongst white, slightly higher, of course, at 17.7%, but overall, the participation rate is at 12.something%. And I think that's an indictment. In terms of housing, right? 13% of the population is living in informal settlement in conditions that are completely horrendous, to say the least, horrific, without access to basic services. And this is because the ANC is unable to resolve the housing backlog. In fact, the housing backlog has grown. When they took power, in 1994, the housing backlog stood at 1.5 million housing units. Today, it's a staggering 3.7 million. And these are the rights of people that are being grossly violated
and we will delve,
by the neoliberal austerity policy of this government.
We will delve into many of those different issues as this conversation unfolds. But let me get Minister Lamola's response to that. Mr. Sibay uses very strong language to characterize the condition of the country. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think anyone watching at home will know that to say that it's a catastrophe is an exaggeration. And I must state that there is no government in the world where there are no challenges. And our country is no exception. And we accept that indeed there are challenges in the country and in South Africa, but with the Bill of Rights, there's a platform to resolve those challenges by South Africans, including workers sitting at NEDLAC where they sit. Firstly, let's deal with the issue of housing. In terms of States SA, this has been one of the biggest achievements of the ANC government to create households. More than 3 million South Africans now living in proper housing, delivered by this government. With regards to the education sector, our NFSAS provision has been the biggest breaker of generational poverty. Graduates in numbers and stats are there to prove it. Most of the South African graduates, even the graduates where there is a high level of unemployment amongst graduates, but at least it's not at the same level as those who are not graduates. Graduates, there is a higher chance of them getting employment than someone who is not a graduate. So Stats SA confirms that this has been the biggest breaker of generational poverty. Secondly, that to say that we have not really moved, even on issues of the economy, is also another factor. That there has been a movement, but it's not enough. That's why we still have this unequal society. Those that were rich under apartheid, white, and so forth, that is what we now need to work on to create that equal society. On housing issues, even above what government has done in terms of RDP houses, stands, and also providing land, restitution, and redistribution, there has also been an abolishment of policy where black people can buy land wherever they want. And you can see it in any part of the country, that has changed the face of housing ownership in South Africa, including in rural areas, where you can now see a proper mansion in some very far, deep rural area of our country. That has been because the ANC government has enabled an environment where assets can now be found in the hands of black people. So there is a change. There are challenges that we must confront.
Mr. Sibay, how do you respond to that?
I mean, firstly, to say there are challenges is a question really here of the trajectory. In what direction are we really traveling, right? Now, houses have been built. At what rate in comparison to the overall growth in population and demand for housing? When you take Johannesburg as an example, right? In Johannesburg, the population every year is growing by something between 120 to 250,000. Now that translates into 1.5 million over a period of 10 years. The city of Johannesburg built public housing, in the whole city of Johannesburg, public housing is built at the rate of 2,500 units a year. That means, right, at the rate at which they're building houses, it will take them 200 years to build enough houses to clear the current backlog of 500,000 units. And in that, I'm not even taking account of the increase in population that I've mentioned, right? That is a reality, and that is a reason squatter camps, squalor, and degradation that is incompatible with the rights that the minister is talking about, with the right to housing, with the right to human dignity. All of that are flagrant violations of the rights of the working class people. Let's also take an example with regard to the labor rights that he actually cite. I mean, when you look at that, it's true, we've made an advancement in terms of recognition of labor rights, but let's be clear about that as well. In actual fact, majority of those rights were conquered in struggles, even in a struggle against apartheid. In many ways, in actual fact, the current Labor Relations Act has been regressive in terms of rolling back what the working class accomplished, in fact, right, in the course of the struggle, in the 80s, in the 90s, and so on. That today, just to exercise the right of strike, you are tied into endless labor dispute resolution mechanisms. There is a right of employer to bring escape labor in a country with a catastrophic levels of unemployment and strike breaking and so on. The union movement is being weakened by the policies of the ANC. That has created levels of precarity, labor broking, outsourcing that has made workers so vulnerable that they are unable to access and exercise most of their rights and so on. So I'm trying to say that you've got to say, what is the condition of the working class in South Africa today? 55% of the population in this country are living below an upper bound of poverty line. This includes 13.8 million people who are living below a food poverty line. How can any serious minister who says he represents the aspirations of the masses of the black working class in this country do not see that as an indictment and do not see that as a testimony of the catastrophe of their policies?
Minister, questions of labor relations and the rights enshrined there, and also questions of poverty are key to the human rights agenda. Your response?
Yeah, I mean, when you read the elections manifesto of the DA, they criticize, they say this is too tight. It gives workers too many rights. They want themselves, when the moonshots come in, they want to fire with ease. They want to relax all the labor rights that we have put in place, which shows that the labor rights that have been put in place have been fit for purpose for our country. And they are a product of a struggle. I agree with him. Workers participated in the creation of the current Labor Relations Act. There is also a platform at NATLEC where workers also have a voice, community members have a voice, and that is the beauty of our struggle. It has given workers a voice at where decisions are made. As we speak now, the minimum wage, which is also a product of workers' struggle, has taken out workers, 6 million workers out of poverty. It has intervened on a number of sectors of the economy. It is proven, it's scientific, it has been researched. There is also evidence that worker rights have been more strengthened in the workplace through the Labor Relations Act, including to equalize even the right to fair labor practice and an equal salary between men and women. That is the latest report of the Employment Equity Act. You can't not see such things. I do agree, and I never denied that there are challenges. I've said, indeed, there are challenges. But to put them at the level of catastrophe, I think it is an exaggeration. Workers should also, as he speaks, he must also acknowledge that, indeed, there has been progress. And acknowledge that this progress is an outcome, indeed, of that struggle between the workers and the state, and also in the platform of NATLEC. And it is not the end. That's why we need to continue with the current policies and the current government, so that we can strengthen where there are challenges with regards to where workers need a solution. And the platform is still there, NATLEC, and there is also an open engagement between government and workers to find a solution as and when challenges arise.
Absolutely. Let's leave it there for the moment. We're going to go to a break, and then we'll continue with this very interesting conversation with not only the Minister of Justice, but also Mr. Sipai, representing worker interests, and we're inquiring into the progress that has been made on the human rights agenda in South Africa. So far, we've covered questions such as housing, worker rights, and the extent of service delivery provision, the gains that have been made in the protections of key civil rights, and the ability for us to even have this show tonight is a step towards progress. But key questions remain over the extent to which we have secured the socio-economic rights that our Constitution so obviously promises our citizens. When we come back from the break, we'll continue to explore to what extent our country has lived up to its ambitious human rights agenda. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We have a very interesting and robust conversation tonight on the extent to which South Africa has lived up to its ideals, especially in the realm of human rights. Of course, this as we commemorate the Sharpeville massacre and we remember Human Rights Day today. Mr. Sepai, can I start with you? The minister makes an interesting point that it's very easy to forget about political rights when you have them. The capacity to criticize the government openly, the ability to vote, the ability to have a free media, the ability to have an independent judiciary. All of these things may not necessarily put bread on the table, but when they are removed, as they are in many places around the world, that really can hurt. Do we underestimate the extent to which we really have secured important political rights in our country?
I'm the last person to do that. In fact, when I started, I spoke about what historic breakthrough, dismantlement of structures of apartheid, the end of repression, the end of institutionalized racism, all of that, right, shouldn't be taken for granted. But also all of that, as I've said, were the conquest of the heroic struggles of the working class. And I think we need to be very clear. A lot of the things that the ANC claims as their own achievements are the things that were achieved even by the end. You see, in the 80s, in the 80s, the revolt of the black working class in all the main theaters of the struggle has reached such a point that in actual fact, apartheid was becoming ungovernable. And most of these rights, if not in law, in actual fact were being attained. Right? And so much so that, in fact, apartheid ended long before it was actually proclaimed to have ended. Right? And I think it's that context that needs to be taken when we assess what were the terms of transition and what has been achieved now. We have characterized 1994 basically as a counter-revolution in a democratic form. What do we mean by that? There was concession. Apartheid couldn't continue, in the way that it did before. Right? That was impossible. The balance of class forces and political power was no longer allowing that. At the same time, the negotiated settlement meant that the real constitution of apartheid regime, which is the property regime of private ownership, monopolized by the big corporation on all key sectors of the economy, the social relations of production, and inequalities in allocation of economic power and resources that flew from that. All of that were retained. And what is the consequence of that? 30 years into democracy, we have the infamy of being the most unequal society. And we have got to take a moment to pause and reflect on that.
Right.
The system of apartheid, a system of legislated inequality, never achieved the level of inequalities that we have today. Right? That has been achieved under a democracy, under a black majority government. That is scandalous, that is criminal, and the fact that every program, including the basic services, that were supposed to be about redistribution of wealth, today, electricity tariffs, water tariffs, access to education, all of these are impoverishment of the working class.
Right.
Many people have to choose between paying, food.
Let me bring in the
and,
minister. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you've made many points there, and I want the minister to be able to respond as well. And we will go on to some of the other points. But Mr. Sepai says the democratic transition really conserved a lot of the elements of at least economic apartheid. What do you make of that? And there have been criticisms of the extent to which, for example, the property clause can actually deliver on land reform and a true change in property redistribution in our country. It's quite an important question when we think of the overall question of human rights.
Yes, isn't it a misnomer that the success of the government should not be attributed to the ANC, but the failures must be attributed to us? I believe that, indeed, most of the successes are a product of the struggle. Firstly, the achievement of the democratic breakthrough. The apartheid government, although they were in a corner, but they were pushed by the struggles of our people to that corner. Ourselves, as the government of the day when we came in 1994, on the workers' rights, it was because workers continued with the struggle. We had to put legislations that respond to the challenges that workers were facing. And that's why we had to come in with the Labour Relations Act. We must claim it as a victory for the workers. Secondly, with regards to the economy, the property clause in particular. The property clause is the most transformative legislation. It is put there as an imperative to deal with land reform. It says you must put these legislations to deal with expropriation. You must put this legislation to deal with issues of redistribution. You must put this legislation to deal in all to also put secure rights of landowners. And we did put a restitution act, which helped us to restitute a percentage of about 10% of the land, in terms of redistribution, about 9%, in terms of acquisition, about 1 point something percentage, and also a number of black people that also bought farms on their own in terms of productive land, and also those that were able to get land on the basis that they were staying in what we now have as the Bantu under the Bantu Administration Act, most of the black townships like Soweto and so forth. So the ANC had to regularize, give those people their title deeds to have some form of ownership. There has been progress even in that regard in terms of percentage, but the progress has not been enough. We acknowledge that it has not been enough. That's why we all have to work in terms of the capacity of the state to be able to deliver in terms of land reform, in terms of creating an equal society. And that's why we need workers, we need everyone to work towards creating that equal society that all South Africans want. And that we must do by capacitating the state and also by creating that enabling society.
Minister, to stick with you, as we focus on the economy, and we will come to social issues after the break as well, and indeed our role in foreign affairs. When it comes to electricity, this has been one of the major gains of the ANC government since 1994. However, I think it's fair to say that there have been really systematic infringements on human rights as a result of the load shedding, shall I call it a pandemic. Would you concede that this has been one of the human rights failures of the government?
How do I deny when there's a court order that says we need to ensure that human rights are protected in terms of the provision of electricity? But you can see there is visible progress. We still have load shedding today, but it's less than 60% than it was in the previous year. And there is clear timelines now that by the end of 2024, there will be no load shedding anymore. And this is confirmed by both analysts, experts, and also the Minister of Electricity. That is the work that we're doing. One of the aspects, as you are aware, under apartheid, it was only provided for a few. We had to provide to all South Africans. It has also led to challenges in the space. We have to respond to that as a society.
Mr. Sabe, how do you respond to that?
I think we've got to get back to the basics. One is, I've said the issue of the trajectory. Today, many people are experiencing increasing levels of energy poverty. Why? Because the tariffs of electricity have increased from 2007 to 2024, right? By 360% in real terms, when you minus inflation, right? When you look at the load shedding, when you look at expansion of informal settlements, it means more and more people are having less access to electricity than they were in the early 90s and so on. That is not progress, that is regression. When you look at the crisis of housing, I've spoken about the numbers. Numbers are shocking. When you look at issues of education, you just go to the black working class schools and so on, and look at the situation there. Those schools that basic infrastructure, basic equipment, basic services, as well as poorly trained staff and so on. That is the reason lots of the middle class people have opted out of public education, have taken their kids to private schools, have taken their kids to a former white, public schools and so on. And the hospitals, right? The clinics, in which 85% of the population in this country are dependent on, are in complete state of collapse. That is the public healthcare sector and so on. That is the reason. When you look at overall healthcare spending, and we're talking here in actual fact, not only about the right to health, about the right to life in essence, because many of our people are dying needlessly because of the state of our public hospital and clinics and so on. 15% of the population, right, consume over 50% of the spending in healthcare in this country. It is those inequalities that, for me, are an indictment in terms of what has been the impact of the policy of the ANC, which I argue have transferred and facilitated a massive transfer of wealth from the vast majority of the black working class to the tiny elite. And that is the reason that we are becoming, we are the most unequal society in the world. I've spoken about the level of poverty, but in actual fact, even that is gross underestimation, because UCT researchers are saying government statistics are underestimating levels of poverty by almost 10%. Because when they take 65 rand a day as a subsistence amount, which is a benchmark that I think other people are using internationally, 2/3 of the population in this country are below an upper bound level of poverty. That is the real record of the ANC. Can I
ask you, Mr. Sabe, as I just asked the minister, a follow-up? When we look at where working class power sat in 1994, and especially in the 80s leading up to the early and mid-90s, working class power was a really formidable force. And we've seen a waning of working class power in South Africa and of the broader worker movement. To what extent do you think that working class movements or at least worker movements have themselves to blame for losing that share of power and becoming a lesser force in our political landscape?
I think the foremost responsibilities has to be put on the government that has, brought about neoliberal restructuring program that, in short, majority of the workers are in precarious forms of, employment, outsourcing, labor broking, and all of that. And that has weakened the workers' movement and its ability to organize. But of course, I agree with you. The leadership of the workers' movement that has tied the ANC, that has supported the ANC, even as it was not only implementing these policies that are actually impoverishing their own members, that are distributing wealth from the poor to the rich, but in actual fact, as they were actually attacking, the very basis of the working class organization and so on, as well as, of course, perpetuating the very property regime that the working class revolted in. The struggle against apartheid wasn't just about replacing a white man at Union Building, of course, right? That was an issue. The fact that we had the regime that is based on the white minority rule was a problem on and by itself. It shouldn't be underestimated.
Right.
But people fought for the land. People fought for the housing. People fought for access to education, to health, and all of these things. When you look at the state of ESCOM, when you look at PRASA, when you look at all the public infrastructure and the state-owned entities that are supposed to be delivering the basic and the most essential services essential to the social wage and the living wage of the working class.
Right.
All of that has been plundered and has been collapsed by the ANC and its corruption.
Let's leave it there. We're in an interesting debate this evening on South Africa's human rights record. We have discussed in this segment the important political rights that have been afforded to South Africans, not only voting rights, but particularly rights of freedom of expression and association, and questioned whether we have taken those for granted over these 30 years of enjoying those rights. We've also spoken, of course, about service delivery and particularly focused on the question of load shedding and its bearing on human rights in South Africa today. And when we come back from the break, of course, South Africa's human rights record is not just about what happens at home, but it's also what we've advocated abroad. And we'll take a look at whether we have lived up to our domestic ideals on the global stage. So stick with us for this fascinating debate on Unfiltered. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Tonight we are discussing and debating a key question that confronts our country. How far have we gone in securing the ambitious human rights that are guaranteed in our Constitution? And of course, 30 years into our democracy and on Human Rights Day, this is the opportune time to address these questions. Minister, of course, in the segment, we're going to move on to some questions of how we've secured human rights or haven't on the international stage. So we will come to that, but let me also give you an opportunity to respond to some of the interventions that were made before the break.
Yeah, I think firstly, there was a complete distortion with regards to access to electricity. There is no way that under apartheid, black people had more access to electricity than now. It's 80% of the population, which includes the majority of black people, have now access to electricity. There is indeed a challenge of load shedding, but that does not mean that black people under apartheid had more access. Where I come from, there was no electricity, and many townships and villages across the country did not have access to electricity under apartheid. Secondly, with regards to the schooling, there were no free schools. There was no provision of food in our schooling system under apartheid. This government has done a lot to provide for the black child that cannot afford for that. Even at the level of higher education, the education was not free. It came after NFSAS to intervene to break that generational poverty. And I think these are interventions that have played a role to create that a black middle class that is now playing a role in the economy. Indeed, it's true that due to inflation, the standard of living or the cost of living is indeed very high. And I think the issues of tariffs do come in. It's a challenge that we need to address through the economy, because it does not mean that because there are challenges, therefore we should not have situations where we need to encourage for the payment of services. The only way municipalities can survive, the only way ESCOM can survive, the only way Rand Water can survive is that South Africans need to pay for the services that are provided by these platforms and systems. But we should do it in a manner that is sustainable, it's reasonable, and it's also affordable, which I accept.
Let me stick with you, Minister, and turn to this question of foreign policy, because, of course, you've been central to South Africa going onto the world stage, the international judicial stage, and calling for human rights for the people of Gaza. To what extent do you think that South Africa has lived up to its domestic values on the world stage?
Yeah, I think we, in terms of the spirit of Ubuntu that has been invoked in the Makwanyana judgment and how South Africans live, we have been able to take that into the international stage. In terms of human rights, our international or foreign policy is indeed informed by human rights, and that can be found on issues of Western Sahara and many other conflict areas where our involvement is premised on human rights, which includes the issues related to Gaza.
Mr. Sabe, how do you respond, and what do you think of the role that South Africa has played on the global stage, particularly in this last year or so, and whether that's something to be celebrated, or whether maybe that's diverting from domestic questions which you've raised?
It has been shameful, it has been treacherous. Let's take two instances in which they have been celebrated. Let's look at the question of Palestine. They've taken an easy fight, going to International Court of Justice, which obviously would support the case to the extent that it has managed to expose Israel in the international opinion. But what is it that they've done in relation to Israel? You have a government here which has characterized, and quite correctly, and we agree, Israel as an apartheid state. Israel is carrying a genocide in a current war in Gaza. Yet it cannot implement comprehensive sanctions, boycotts, and divestment policies, right? The apartheid regime in this country was boycotted, was sanctioned when 69 people died at Sharpeville, right? Over 32,000 people have died in Gaza. This government not only refused to implement comprehensive sanction and boycott, in actual fact, they have allowed Zionist companies to come and take a very key sectors of the South African economy. Milcom, which is an Israeli company that operates in a illegal Jewish settlement on Palestinian land, have taken the biggest dairy manufacturer in this country. It has crushed the conditions of the workers in that company. 62% of the wages were cut. Workers are working a 12-hour working shift. Van assistants were reduced from 2 to 1. The conditions are horrific. If they couldn't reject that takeover in solidarity with the people of Gaza, they could have done it, even with their own workers. That is the extent of the treachery in this matter and so on. And that is because, in reality, the ANC, the moment it accepted the economic foundations of an apartheid regime and took them over, that is the private ownership, it became integrated in a global capitalist system, and particularly a Western imperialism in which Zionist interests are very powerful. And that is the reason they cannot decisively break with it. The other instance is DRC, right? You see, the idea that South African regime is there to maintain peace is basically illusion. The reality is they have propped a Kabila regime there that had basically, as a dictatorship, created a horrific conditions at the same time as it allows the plunder, the colonial plunder of the mineral resources of the people of Congo and so on. And you just have to look at the policy of this government, right? The idea that you could have a government that mowed down the mine workers here at Rustenburg in defense of the corporate profits in the mining industry, that it will act otherwise in DRC and anywhere where it is soldiers, I argue those soldiers are the private security of the mining industry there, because in the final analysis, as we have always argued, that the foreign policy of any government is an application at the international level of the domestic policy of that government.
Right.
A government killing mine workers in defense of the profits of the mining industry will not behave otherwise in DRC or anywhere else.
Minister, on South Africa's foreign policy and our actions both in terms of the Israel-Palestine conflict and on the African continent, any further thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, firstly to say that we took an easy fight is it's a complete distortion of reality. This was not an easy decision. Everyone from across the globe knows. We were maligned, we were called all manner of names. The country was threatened with disinvestment. Everything you can dream about. It's not an easy fight to take the Zionist state of Israel. And everyone is aware. So to come here in this show and say it was just an easy fight, I think it's cheap politicking. The issue of Israel, we are aware that we have already downgraded the embassy. And DERCO is still assessing what further should be done. Informed by the assessment and the outcomes, further decisions will be taken. With regards to the DRC, the deployment of the Defense Force has been done through a SADC mission. You'll be aware that in the past we have participated through a UN mission, which there have been challenges with the DRC and so forth. Now it has been done through SADC, and all SADC countries are contributing to that force, which is going to keep peace in the east of the DRC, to help the situation in that environment. But there's also been a clear message from the president that the solution there should be political. There must be engagement between all the warring factions, the government of the DRC and all the warring factions, including Rwanda and other countries that have got a role in the conflict. What he's saying is conspiratorial. How can you say the defense force that is under a SADC mission is a private army? Really, it's an insult to our armed forces who are there on a mission of SADC, clearly deployed and with clear protocols to protect and safeguard the lives of civilians.
Let's go to a break on Unfiltered this evening. We are discussing the central question of exactly how far South Africa has gone to secure human rights, both at home and in this segment we've been speaking about its actions abroad over the last 30 years and in recent times. When we come back, the question of corruption is central to human rights and the extent to which the funds that are in government coffers go to the people who need them most. And we'll conclude our discussion with the way forward, as well as a discussion on the extent to which the state has overcome the scourge of corruption over the last 30 years. Stick with us for this important debate. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Tonight we're discussing human rights on this Human Rights Day and the extent to which South Africa has secured those human rights. Of course, the question of corruption is one that has been a centerpiece of the current administration, battling corruption and where corruption raises its head, dealing with it decisively. Minister, could I come to you on that question? Of course, you've been central in terms of South Africa's attempt to grapple with the state capture report and re-strengthen law enforcement institutions. Of course, we've heard recently that the Speaker of Parliament has decided to take special leave around corruption-related allegations. Any comment from you on that, and then the deeper question of whether we are winning this battle against corruption?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Caesar. Obviously, on the matter related to the Speaker, I will prefer to leave it to the law enforcement authorities, the NPA and those that are dealing with the matter, in line with the spirit of the separation of powers. I can comment on with regards to the report on state capture and also the overall functioning of the NPA, because we are mandated to provide them with resource. You will know that for almost 9 to 10 years, the NPA's budget has been reduced. And we have been clawing back in the past 5 years to help them stabilize, to rebuild the institutions. And I believe they have been doing that gradually, and they are moving towards the right direction. We have also resourced them to help with the ID. As you are aware, the president re-established them in terms of a proclamation. And there is about 200 people accused from the state capture report, about 74 cases in our courts. We have recovered, and they have recovered almost 12 to 15 billion rands. Both the NPA and the SIU back into the fiscus and also into the state-owned enterprises that were affected by that. And that is the first step, because the accountability in corruption does not only start when people are criminally charged, but also when the money is recovered, which now has been recovered, and there is ongoing work, and people are going through our court processes.
Mr. Sebe, what do you make of the battle against corruption and the extent to which we have been able to reverse that trajectory in the last 5 years, and how it relates to human rights?
You can't solve that problem because, you see, ANC is really just a criminal syndicate. I think we've got to call it what it is. And that's just not because of the lapse in terms of individual morality of people and lack of judgment and so on, and ethics and so on. It is because corruption is functional to the accumulation as well as a transformation of the entire black capitalist class on which the ANC actually rests. Because what is it that is making this class? It's about, tenders and everything that really entail the plunder of the state on the industrial scale that we've seen. And that's the reason when you go to the leadership of the ANC, right? It looks like, the criminal list of wanted people, basically, from the president. You can go and you can, almost each and every one of them, probably with few exceptions, would you say that there is really no instance of corruption, right? That's the reality of the situation. And I think it is these that have collapsed, the state-owned entities that we rely on for delivery of services essential to access and realizing of rights, to education, to electricity, to water, and all those things and so on. So again, this is really a form of violence against the working class.
Right. I believe we have some comments on social media from our conversation this evening. So let me go to some of those comments and then ask my guests to respond. To Minister Lamula, who stated this week that the UAE refuses to cooperate in the processes of extraditing the Gupta brothers, with them rejecting our first application without feedback. A second application is likely to be rejected again. How can we hold UAE accountable? Rob says law-abiding citizens' rights have regressed. Criminals have all the rights. So those are two of the social media comments. I don't know if the extent to which you're able to respond to any of those, Minister.
Yeah, no, thank you, Caesar. Firstly, the ANC is not a criminal enterprise. It's a liberation movement aimed to advance the national democratic revolution and the struggle of the people of South Africa. The issues of leadership, the ANC is in a process of renewal, and it's an ongoing process. And that's why from time to time there will be processes dealing with those that are charged, those that have been found wanting in any process. It's the only organization with that system in the country that deals with its own members when there are issues. With regards to the two comments, firstly, indeed it's true that I have stated that the UAE is not cooperating. We are looking at various platforms, including UN bodies. As you are aware, the issues that we are dealing with falls within the UN Convention Against Corruption, where it's expected that countries must cooperate with each other and they must not use even small technicalities to respond and deal with issues. So it is in that context that we asked several questions to the UAE state to respond to why did the first request fail. And they have not been able to respond to us. They are not cooperating. And our prosecutors that were supposed to meet with them could not meet with them. That creates a conundrum for us that if you resubmit when you don't know what was the real problem with the first instance, because we truly believe that it was in compliance with our extradition treaty that we have with the UAE. With regards to the second issue, it is indeed most of the perception and the feeling of South Africans that criminals have got more rights, which is not the case. But we have started a process of the review of the Criminal Procedure Act of 1977 to make it victim-centric, to make it responsive, and also to align with the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, and to ensure that we give more weight to the rights of victims equally in the process of the criminal justice system. Just very briefly, when do you think that review will be done? Because that's a very important piece of work that you've undertaken. Yeah, just on the 28th and 29th of February, we hosted a conference on the Criminal Procedure Act where we received lots of inputs, and there is a draft bill that has just been, will just be concluded by the department. So before the end of this term, we will have come up with a draft bill, but unfortunately it will not be able to go through Parliament in this period. It is something we'll need to introduce first in the first period or first quarter of next year, when we come back after the elections, to be able to continue to conclude and conclude in the struggle for the people of South Africa. Absolutely, and I'd just like to thank you both, my panelists, for tonight, for a wonderful debate. Mr. Sabay, for being brave enough to raise difficult questions in the presence of a minister, and Minister Lamola for
being here as a minister, engaging in debate and really making yourself available, I think you're a credit to and an example to your colleagues. So thank you for joining us for this debate and conversation and allowing us to have these conversations.
It's the nature of our democracy, isn't it? Thank you.
Indeed. With that, we can agree on that tonight was an example of human rights. Thank you both for a wonderful debate this evening. Thank you for joining us as the audience for our conversation tonight. Not only a leader of workers' struggles, but also a high-ranking government official tonight, engaging in debate and discussion on the gains that we have made as a country over the last 30 years, but also the real challenges, maybe crises that we continue to try and confront and overcome. Have we made it to the promised land? No, but how far have we gone? That remains a question for debate, and I believe we can continue to have that debate on social media at Unfiltered SABC. Thank you once again for joining us for yet another installment of Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations. Have a good night.